Well, guys, it's time. Don't forget, quiz 3 tonight, 11:59. I have 9 of them as I came into class, which is more than half, but don't forget. And so, kind of want to pick up on a couple of things here. What we're talking about is kind of the late 18th century, the 1700s, and we saw the French Rococo, which was very ornamental. The subject matter was whimsical or frivolous. It was really about a lot of wealthy aristocracy and upper class just having a good time doing what they do. And then we bounced over to England and we looked at this stuff here. William Hogarth and the printmaking. I showed you the video on this, and we start to see that in a lot of ways the artists themselves are really taking much more ownership of their work. Now they still do, as we can see here with Gainsborough, doing portrait painting. And we got another one here, Sir Joshua Reynolds, Lord Heathfield. But what's happening here is that aside from trying to put food on the table and doing portraits, they really start to have much more latitude in choosing the subject, and in a lot of ways how they paint that subject too. And I want to kind of, how should I say this? Last week, I talked to you a little bit about the difference between illustration and narrative. And in a lot of ways, most artists were, in a lot of ways, illustrators. Just like we would talk about illustrators today. You got a subject, you put it into visual terms so that people can understand it. That's all of these religious paintings are that way. There's a lot of latitude in that we have pictures of the Madonna and Child, and some of the children look like little babies. Some of them look like very small and very old men, you know, different kinds of things. But it was illustrating a story. The story was there. The Pope said, I want you to make this story real in my church. And so they do. And so you can go back to history. You can talk about the pharaohs of Egypt and the pharaoh saying, I am your subject matter for your art, but I want you to show me as being very powerful and maybe on the status of being divine, that I am a God king, say. And so anyway, what we find here is that really a lot of the people that sponsors the artwork aren't really controlling it quite as much as they used to. And so I want to go to this one. This is kind of an interesting painting. Paul Revere, one of our heroes from the Revolutionary War, and he was a metalsmith by trade. And that's what he has here. He has a a pewter teapot in his hand, and that's what he did for a living. He was a metal worker. He would make fine things out of semi-precious metals, silver, copper, stuff. Anyway, this is him, John Singleton Copley, and we see here, just saying, the way that Copley does Paul Revere is right out of the playbook of European art. The chiaroscuro, the dark modeling, the light on striking the face on one side so much that you can't really make out the other side of his face. This contrast is so great. He has the shine here, he has the shine on the metal, and we don't really know about Copley, but it may be, looking at the size, 3 feet, little under 3 feet by a little over 2 feet. That's really the approximate size of the Van Eyck paintings that we know he did that with the camera obscura and had strong light coming in so that they could capture the image. But anyway, our art in the United States, in Mexico, in South America, Canada, can't forget Canada. Just saying, bottom line, it's really right out of the European playbook. It won't be significantly different for quite a long time. And what happens in Europe over these years is that Europe races ahead. There will be a lot of changes we're going to see. We're going to start to see some of those changes today. And so, talking about the European playbook, we start to see this idea reemerge. The idea of this neoclassicism. We start to see a revival. Yet again, we saw that at various points. We saw it big time in the Italian Renaissance. And so we see neoclassical themes start to emerge. And there's one that I already talked about a little bit. This was actually the first illustration in chapter 26. Cornelia presenting her children as treasures. And when I was talking to you about that, this was neoclassicism, and this looks like a scene right out of ancient Rome, but the message was right out of what we thought, or what we thought we knew about ancient Greece and Rome. And that was the high point of European civilization. And although this was almost like 2,000 years after the fact, bottom line is that they look back at this with great reverence. And so after the Romans, you guys been in the classes, hopefully you'll remember that there was this kind of the Middle Ages. Some scholars call it the Dark Ages. There's this time where European culture is not particularly moving forward. In fact, it regresses. And they lose a lot of the knowledge. They lose a lot of the skills. They lose a lot of the culture. And the culture kind of survives, going back through this, in the monasteries and these little places where the barbarians were the Nordic hordes, the Vikings and everybody else, they're all beating each other over the head with clubs. There are these places where European culture is protected. But we have this reemergence. And I might add to that, This is the oath of the Horatii. This is Jacques Louis David. He becomes actually the biggest, most well-known painter and authority on neoclassical art. He's a Frenchman. He is on the side of the revolutionists during the French Revolution, and he is trying to speak to European antiquity. All of this is supported in a lot of ways by the learned, the scholars of the era. Kind of pull this back into American history. We know that we had, during the American Revolution and the beginnings of the American Republic, some educated men, like Thomas Jefferson, for example. Well, when someone was educated, almost always men, it was a sexist period, but bottom line is that all of these learned men were well-versed in the classics. That's what they learned. They went back and read Plato and Aristotle, and they learned Euclidean geometry and all kinds of things that went right back to antiquity. And so that becomes kind of not only the art style, it becomes the dominant art style in architecture, and it becomes really pretty much the guiding principle in this period of time. And I gotta see if I can get this converted as a PDF. Looks like, okay, let me make sure. I gotta get some volume on it.
Many of the largest galleries in the Louvre in Paris, it's filled with enormous paintings. We're looking at Jacques-Louis David's Oath of the Horatii. This painting that was made in 1784 and exhibited in 1785. And this painting stole the show. It was absolutely new. Nobody had ever seen anything like it.
The prevailing style in France was the Rococo. You could think about artists like Boucher or Fragonard, a style that appealed to the aristocracy.
And even in the kind of history painting that was made for the king, the style had become formulaic. It had become tired. But David's Oath of the Horatii establishes a new style that we call neoclassicism.
Critics like Diderot are calling for an art that depicts virtuous behavior, very different from the prevailing Rococo style. And this painting answers that call.
This is the tail end of the period in France that we call the Enlightenment, with philosophers like Rousseau, Diderot, and Voltaire, who posit the idea that the rational should supersede tradition and spiritual.
The church was incredibly powerful. The monarchy in France was incredibly powerful. And the philosophers of the Enlightenment are asking questions about the validity of these very established institutions.
And remember, it will only be a few years before the French Revolution begins.
This is exhibited in 1785, the revolution is 1789.
The American Revolution was already taking place, based in large part on the ideas of French Enlightenment philosophers.
We have a story from early ancient Roman history.
The early Roman state is at war with the neighboring city of Alba.
But instead of the armies of each side going to war, they decided to send 3 brothers from each side to battle it out. Whoever survives is the side that's victorious.
The Romans choose the Horatii, and the city of Alba chooses the Horatii.
But things get very complicated because there are intermarriages between these 2 families. So no matter who wins,
Both sides will lose.
exactly,
What we see is the father of the Horatii holding swords aloft as the sons take an oath to battle to the death.
for Rome.
On the right, you see 3 women and 2 children. There's some disagreement as to who the woman in blue is in the back.
We see 2 young women in the foreground. One of them is a Horatii sister, and she's married to one of the Horatii brothers.
The other is a Horatii by birth, but will marry one of the Horatii,
Families will be torn apart by this vow,
no matter what happens.
by making the women appear so curvilinear, so passive. They don't even have their eyes open. David is suggesting an idea that was very prevalent in the philosophy of Rousseau, for example, that women could not be true citizens of the state. They were unable to think about civic responsibility. Women could only think about the personal and the familial.
And look at how David has depicted that contrast. If women are curvilinear, if their bodies are limp, the male figures are rigid, they are upright, they are tall, they are strong.
They are angular in the forms of their bodies. They raise their arms together. There's a sense of purpose that is completely absent from the women who appear to be just victims of circumstance here.
Young men are working in unison. Their arms salute in unison. There is clearly a reference to the idea of strength in a kind of brotherhood, in a kind of collective.
David represents all of this in a classical, classicizing style, looking back to ancient Greece and Rome. There is an interest in the anatomy of the body, of carefully depicting the musculature, the movement of the body that is directly from ancient Greek and Roman art.
In fact, the lighting, which rakes across the surface, reminds me of an ancient Greek or Roman relief carving. And all of this is set within a simplified stone interior with rounded Roman arches, simplified Tuscan columns, and a pavement that creates a geometric stage for these figures.
And if we follow the orthogonal lines created by that pavement, we end at a vanishing point.
Right where the father's hand clasps the swords.
If we think about the lushness, the luxuriousness of Rococo painting, to me, this painting is the exact opposite. It's one that speaks of the virtue of simplicity over the indulgence of Rococo style, exactly what the Enlightenment philosophers were calling for artists to do.
The audiences recognized that stark contrast. In fact, this salon had to stay open longer than it had originally been scheduled, just to accommodate the numbers of people that wanted to see it.
One of the most fascinating things about this painting is that during the revolution, the brothers and their willingness to die for their country resonates with the revolutionaries who must make sacrifices of themselves and their families for the ideals of the revolution.
And David does become a revolutionary himself, and so it's very tempting to read back into this painting. But we have to remember that the painting was completed several years before the revolution, although it was certainly informed by the same philosophical values that the revolution was founded on.
David not only becomes a revolutionary, he votes for the beheading of the king. We're talking about an artist who is very politically engaged.
And this painting becomes an icon for the revolution.
When I look at this painting, I sense that patriotic fervor that must have been so palpable in the early years of the revolution, when people were able to rise up against the abuses of a monarchy and to begin to imagine a republic for France.
Hold up a second, I gotta. There's what I need. And so that's what I was talking about. The ideas are right out of ancient Greece and Rome. I wanted to point out a couple of things that they didn't say in this. Look at the size of this painting. You kind of saw a little bit of that when you saw in the Louvre the people standing next to the painting, looking at the painting. And so, yeah, it is like huge. And that's something that comes in this time of neoclassicism and Romanticism. These French artists start painting on an epic scale. And I want to pull a quote back from David Hockney that is really true. It's worth remembering that before the camera, artists were the ones who controlled images. There was no other way to have images except through what artists did. And so on that note, now we got a time when the artists are actually picking the subject matter and picking the way that it's depicted. As you saw here, David was a revolutionary, voted for the beheading of the king. And one word that kind of popped up in there a couple of times was the republic. You hear that word a lot. You hear a lot about that word in American politics. We got Democrats and Republicans, but a republic is a country that is independent of other countries and governed by its own people, not a monarch. And so that's really kind of important to know. And if you pull out a globe here and look at all of the countries that have republic in their names, say the People's Republic of China, the People's Republic of North Korea, the Republic of Congo, the Islamic Republic of Iran. A lot of countries that were once colonized or dictated to by other countries often put republic in their official name when they renamed their country, because they want the whole world to know we govern ourselves. And so even sometimes when it may not exactly be true, but we got places like through history, the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics. And the idea of the USSR back before the Berlin Wall fell was that these countries were all supposed to be republics that were united through Moscow. And of course, when the Soviet Union dissolved, then all of those former Soviet republics became their own countries, like Ukraine. You can trace this back like that. And so republic, that's a Greek idea. And I said before I played that film clip, they were talking about the women here and being soft, and they weren't capable of politics. They were mostly just capable of raising a family and stuff. Out of this time, and I would be remiss if I didn't bring up these issues, but there was a downside to all of this, and one of them is just what I said. There was the Age of Enlightenment, but it wasn't exactly enlightenment. That's why women could not vote in the United States until 1920. And there was other kinds of misdeeds carried out with this so-called Age of Enlightenment too. And but at any rate, neoclassicism And you saw this one in there. This guy, Marat, this is a painting by David. If you've ever read Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, back in my day, that was like junior level high school reading. This is a guy that was a revolutionary. He was had a leadership position, and he had a skin illness that required him to soak in a bathtub for long periods of time. So that's where he's at. He's in his tub and he's working, writing letters and commanding or communicating with the revolutionaries from here. And a woman, Charlotte Corday, traitorous, she comes in and stabs him to death. And that's what this is about. He dies in his tub, blood, hand in hand. Anyway, the death of Marat. And so he is really kind of one of the martyrs for the revolution. And got a little architecture here. This is Pantheon of Saint Genevieve. Roman, Greek. Oh, wait. I got to back up a little bit too. I want to make another point. Sorry, I'm so disorganized. Must be this energy thing. Bottom line, I wanted to say a couple of words about how this is put together. And this is like really neoclassical too. Those guys on the Khan Academy video talked about how this was orderly. And orthogonals all converge right there at the three swords, and it's all nicely put together. It's very stable. And then they analyzed the curvilinear with the women, and they don't even have their eyes open. They're kind of, off to the side. One of the things about neoclassical painting was that a lot of times they use this same technique, that tenebrism, that chiaroscuro. They put a dark background on their works, and here you go. Here it is again. This is neoclassical, but in this one you can see that what they were referring to as the Tuscan columns and the Roman arches. It is the ancient architecture, but the darkness is meant to actually push the action forward. And this is something that they get from the Rococo. And that is the sense of theatrical setting. And this looks like it could be a play, the way it's set up. And so that is neoclassicism. As I said, David becomes sort of the emblematic artist of neoclassicism. And after the revolution, David actually becomes the president of the French Academy of Art. And he selects his faculty, and he teaches neoclassical virtues and neoclassical paintings to a whole generation of students. And that persists for like about 100 years, actually. And there's another thing I wanted to point out too, and this is kind of an aside, but look at how these Horatii, the three brothers, are holding their arms like this. You ever see anything like this in history? Like Heil Hitler? Were you thinking that? You were correct. Yeah, not that these guys are Nazis or anything, but we're going to be into the 20th century here pretty soon. And what you'll need to know is that just like these guys referenced how should I say this? They referenced classical European cultures. Hitler was like huge. The Nazis were huge on trying to get all of the symbolism, all of the pomp, all of the pageantry of ancient Greece and Rome, and they had their same kind of victory parades and stuff, just like Caesar would have had. And on top of which, Hitler kind of stole some things from other parts of the world. For instance, their flag, red flag, white circle in the middle, and in the middle of that, a black swastika. A swastika was something that Hitler stole from South Asia. It's a holy symbol. Pokit knows what I'm talking about. Yeah, it's a holy symbol. And a lot of things in Buddhist and Hindu culture goes right from that symbol. It's a cross, and it's a broken cross, and it goes around in a circle that way. It represents a lot of the spiritual tenets of Eastern religion. But Hitler took it and made something evil out of it. So anyway, just saying. But in a kind of a way, these when they steal this stuff, they they know it's effective. They may soil the imagery, and they may bring negative and evil connotations to something that is good. But anyway, these are just neoclassical buildings. They start showing up in Germany, France, England. And they were doing a lot of these, that they were just making small Greek temples, just like in a park or something, just in public places. They really didn't have a function. And there we go. There's a portico here. And so all over Europe, you start to see neoclassicism come back in architecture, but also in the US. And I was just talking about Thomas Jefferson being an educated man of the era, studied a lot of ancient writers, philosophers, mathematicians, neoclassicism. In fact, a lot of the founding fathers in the US referenced a lot of the writings from the ancient Greeks. The idea of a democracy is a Greek idea. It was named after a guy named Democritus, by the way. And on top of which, early in this American Republic, what they had here, a lot of these early American leaders, they called themselves Democratic Republicans. Today, that would seem like a contradiction. And then they changed it early in the 19th century to just Democratic Party, but it wanted to be both self-governing. And the democratic part of it is that they have elections where we vote for our leaders. So being a democratic republic, not a contradiction at all, at least then. But this is Monticello. This is on the back of a nickel, by the way. If you ever want to take a look at Monticello and you got 5 cents, you can, But at any rate, Thomas Jefferson established the University of Virginia, and the whole campus is done in a neoclassical style. And here's some more from the University of Virginia, the rotunda and lawn, and you see the columns, it's just, and the triangular pediment, the dome, etc. And so what we have here, and I'm gonna, this kind of almost the end of this this presentation, but even when they were doing statues of these leaders, they did them in something of a neoclassical style. And so this is a sculpture of George Washington, as I was talking about with the portrait of Paul Revere, really very much right out of Western European culture. And then finally, I have this one. And this comes a little later, still in the middle of neoclassical thinking, George Washington, Horatio Greenough. You ever seen this before? No, it was very unpopular when it was made, and it's at the Smithsonian now, but Greenough was commissioned to do a portrait sculpture of George Washington, and he did this, and this is like so over the top neoclassical that was just maybe a little bit too much. This is like George Washington as Zeus. You see, he's got the sword in his hand and pointing to the loftier things by the grace of God. But he's bare-chested, wearing something of a Roman toga, probably, sandals, sitting in what might be considered to be an imperial throne. Anyway, Greenough did this work and it kind of remained in obscurity. Nobody wanted to put it into a public place. And then finally the Smithsonian grabbed it. It's where you can see it. And it's not as much for the artistic value as much as it is this curiosity. There are times when in America, the neoclassical is seen to be going just a little bit too far. Same thing happened with the Washington Monument, because it is the shape of an Egyptian obelisk. And there were people at the time who strenuously objected to this being Washington's monument because it was pre-Christian, it was Egyptian, they're pagan, not in the neoclassical Greco-Roman. Anyway, and I was just reading another, I was reading an article about the Washington Monument just about a week ago, I guess it was. And one of the things when they built the Washington Monument was that the people, the organization that actually put this together, wanted to get bricks from all of the countries all over the world. You know, and kind of like how we do out here in the sidewalk, all of the alum, we see their names on the bricks. You know, that's an old thing. It's traditional. But there was a big anti-Catholic sentiment in Washington at that time. And the Vatican sent a brick and they wanted to use it in the Washington Monument, and it caused quite enough. Anyway, I've got this here too, and because neoclassical architecture, gotta make sure I still got the share here. Yeah, we're good. You can just Google image this and it shows you about everything we can see. There's a little picture over here on the side of the Washington Monument, which is in technically neoclassical as well. But here the Jefferson Memorial. There's Jefferson. The Lincoln Memorial, I think that's what this is from the side and back. The Capitol building, neoclassical. And in fact, they hired an architect named LaFont. How many of you been in Washington, D.C.? So you see, LaFont's name is all over the place there. He was the city planner and he was an architect, and he pretty much laid out the whole city because there was no city there. In fact, it was called Foggy Bottom. It was right there on the Potomac River, and it was a big swamp. And they built Washington, D.C. on that spot. Bottom line, though, is that LaFont had this grounding in neoclassical architecture. And so that is why we see all of this stuff. He didn't design all of the buildings, but he started the plan and got things rolling, and then almost virtually everything until really the 20th century, everything built in Washington was in neoclassical style. And so okay, I gotta make sure I got my screen shared low. It looks like it. So the Napoleonic Empire, 1812. One of the things that happens in the 19th century, after the American Revolution, after the French Revolution, what we have is kind of a change. We still have artists choosing their style, many of them neoclassical artists. And then we have the emergence of a rival style. And that would be this right up here, Romanticism. And so anyway, I'll talk about the Napoleonic Empire here because it has everything to do with Romanticism. But just as an overview, neoclassicism in the arts is an aesthetic attitude based on the art of Greece and Rome in antiquity. So if you didn't miss the first half hour of what I've been saying, there it is, simply put. And it invokes harmony, clarity, restraint, universality, and idealism. And those are the ideals, you know, the brave young men that are going to fight to the death for their city-state, the Horatii. In the context of tradition, classicism refers to either to the art produced in antiquity or to later art inspired by that of antiquity. That's why we get the neo part. While neoclassicism always refers to the art produced later, but inspired by antiquity. But Romanticism becomes almost a counterpoint. Romanticism, attitude, intellectual orientation that characterized many works of literature, painting, music, architecture, criticism, and historiography in Western civilization over a period from the late 18th century, which is late 1700s, to the mid 19th century, kind of through about 1860-ish. Those of you who wrote in quiz one, that was quiz one, about Albert Bierstadt, He's an American romantic painter, but we'll talk about that. Romanticism can be seen as a rejection of the precepts of order, calm, harmony, balance, idealization, and rationality that typified classicism in general and late 19th century neoclassicism in particular. It was also, to some extent, a reaction against the Enlightenment. Why I really wanted to tie that in, the age of enlightenment, Jefferson, neoclassicism, the architecture of Washington, D.C., the paintings of David, Angelica Kaufman, and so on. That had its flaws, as we just pointed out some of them. The fact that there was a kind of a sexist attitude, there was a kind of in a lot of ways, a white supremacist attitude built into a lot of these ideals. And so it was a reaction against the Enlightenment and against 18th century rationalism and a physical materialism in general. And the physical materialism is actually the Rococo. That is physical materialism on steroids. This is me. These are my lovers. We go on a yacht and go out to Cythera and yada, yada, yada. Anyway. Romanticism emphasized the individual, the subjective, the irrational, the imaginative, the personal, the spontaneous, the emotional, the visionary, and the transcendental. Whoa, that's a lot of big words strung together. But I'll show you what that means. Neoclassicism, also known as the Age of Enlightenment, is also known as the predominant movement in European art and architecture in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Romanticism is a term that changes within the art, that describes changes within the art. 1760, 1870. That's why I include Bierstadt. Anyway, these changes can be seen as a direct reaction against the values of neoclassicism. The visual arts of neoclassicism were serious, unemotional. And if you think about David, that's really what that is a call to. Don't be like those weak women over there crying. Don't be emotional, be brave. And so, unemotional and heroic. There's a use of somber colors to convey a moral narrative defined by self-sacrifice and self-denial. And that is another thing, and we'll see some of this in the upcoming art. The ones that tend towards neoclassicism tend to use, as it says here, somber colors, but you'll see they'll be, in a lot of ways, almost predominantly blue. And in the visual arts of Romanticism, nature was a dominant theme. However, nature was regarded as an uncontrollable and unpredictable power, which can result in cataclysmic extremes. Often in British and French paintings of this age, there's a recurrence of images that depict shipwrecks. This depiction symbolizes men's struggle against nature. And I thought that was really good. So here are two early 19th century French painters. Ang, right here, Delacroix, right there. This guy is a neoclassicist. This guy is a romanticist. And guess what? It's the first time I've been able to show you any of these artists. At least a photograph of them. You know, and they do self-portraits and things, but you know, These are photographs, and this has got something to do with all of this too. But here, I'll show you, this is Delacroix versus Ong. And so here is Ong, here is Delacroix, and this is a political cartoon, and they're fighting each other. And Ong says, "Viva la line." And so, what does that mean? That means that neoclassicism really relies on line. The line in that you can see identifiable lines. It wasn't a mistake. In fact, it was very astute that the Khan Academy people did the curvilinear lines for the women. Line to the neoclassicist reveals everything. Line is the most important element, and that's why the orthogonals all come together. Line, that is what is in essence an implied line. And the brothers all with their hands like this, all three lined up. Line, line. Delacroix, romantic. You can't read this. And I don't speak French, but I'll tell you what this is about. Viva la color. And you see, he has a paintbrush. And romantic artists are really very much involved in the use of color. And in fact, these guys would argue, this is a political cartoon, but they were basically both public figures at this time in France, well known. And in fact, in that Khan Academy video, right next to the David, there was Delacroix right next to it, both from early 19th century France. Bottom line is that the Romantics explored the emotional power of color. And so I was just telling you about how the neoclassicists had somber colors, and blue seems to be the color of choice for a lot of neoclassical works. And Romantics, they like to use reds and yellows and warm colors, vibrant colors. And somebody like Ong, this is, if you ever get a chance, that you go to graduate school and you'll read about this stuff. What happens at this time is that neoclassicists consider the Romantic artists as being reckless and irresponsible. Why would you make paintings that would appeal to the emotions? We make art that appeals to the logic, to the ideals, to the virtues. All of this romantic stuff designed to appeal to the emotions, that's just downright wrong. And so that's what this cartoon is about. And so got another map here. Yeah, we'll go through it. So here's Romanticism, early Romanticism, Napoleon visiting the plague-stricken in Jaffa. And this is in the Middle East. I think it's in Syria. Could be, can I zoom in on this? See, this is a PDF. Yeah, won't let me. Maybe inspect. No, I don't want the code. You just have to take my word for it. Here's Napoleon. And you see, the brushwork is loose. It doesn't have that sense of structure that a neoclassical painting would have. And it says the plague-stricken in Jaffa. This had been called the pest house in Jaffa. what a pest house is. If you're annoying, they send you to a pest house. You guys don't believe that. Okay, I'll give you the truth when all else fails. A pest house is when you had diseases. And if you ever heard the word pestilence, that means that a plague has come over the population, pestilence, everybody's sick. And this is a place, this could have been where they put lepers, people with leprosy and other kinds of diseases. It was basically a place where you'd go to die. And what happens with Napoleon is that he rides into the Middle East, conquering the Middle East. And some of his soldiers get these diseases they had never been exposed to, and so they end up here. And we see Napoleon, and you see that? He's like touching the swords on this guy's side. The guy's raising his arm, and this has been said to comparing Napoleon to Jesus healing the sick. This is what we're doing here. We got Napoleon on such a high place of esteem, of honor, and we portray him. And he just goes right in there, and you can see it is, some of these people are actually dying or dead. They're just all of these bodies lying unafraid. Napoleon, the French hero. And so one of the things that the romantic artists do, they like to splash a lot of red around and talking about that. But this is early romanticism. And so neoclassical architecture, here we go. There's David, Napoleon crossing the St. Bernard Pass, and this is the Alps, and there he is. But even though we got a lot of red here, that's a kind of a muted red. It's kind of toned down. The horse, as I was saying, blue, they love that blue. Look, that horse almost looks blue, the way it's modeled with that predominantly blue ground and a lot of the shadowing being in blues and so on. But again, both sides, the romantics and the neoclassicists, they seem to love Napoleon. And I got this piece here. Kehinde Wiley. You might know Kehinde Wiley. I get to tell you guys a lot of stuff you don't know about. I like that. Kehinde Wiley. He's a contemporary artist. He's the guy that in the National Portrait Gallery painted the portrait of Barack Obama. And he's like probably my age, somewhere in there. And what he does, he's an African-American artist, and what he does is go back through art history and make paintings based on the art history, but putting in African-American figures. And in part, because what you don't see at this time, and this is part of what I was saying about the flaws of the Age of Enlightenment and neoclassicism, is that women don't get a full share in the franchise, neither do people of color. And so he goes back and he paints all of these famous paintings and puts young African Americans in there. And this piece sits in the Brooklyn Museum. If you ever go to New York and you see the Met and the MoMA, Get on the train, go to the Brooklyn Museum too. It's like really rocks. But at any rate, yeah, this guy, he's been doing that a lot, and he uses the art history. The guy's a wonderful painter. And you see the horse, everything. Oh, it's pretty close to being similar, the cape and stuff. I like the difference here. Napoleon's got these boots on. This guy's got some Air Jordans or something. Got some kicks. Just saying. Anyway, I love this guy, but there's a lot of people today, and I have to make that talk about that a little bit here too. And that is that this David is, for anybody who studied art, that David crossing the pass at Saint Bernard, that is like huge. You would know that like if you were studying rock and roll music and you would know Elvis, just saying. I mean, it's like, or the Beatles or something, just that big, that huge, and that recognizable, which makes Wiley's work all that more effective. And there are a lot of artists today who go back and mine this art history. Mine, like, I mean, you dig it up and you find gold. And you can repurpose these images in a lot of ways. And as I was saying earlier today, artists begin to have more autonomy over their work. They're just not merely illustrators, but they're actually creating their own narratives. This is something that will persist until the present day. And this is where you get that phrase, art for art's sake, because we're not doing it for the Pope or the president or anybody. So anyway, here's another David, the coronation of Napoleon and Josephine. And this is quite a grand event, coronation, making Napoleon wasn't considered a king, but he was considered an emperor, the head of the French Empire. And so, and see, you got the church people, the bishops, and everybody's in on this. And so it's neoclassicism. We get this. This is an Italian sculptor, Cupid and Psyche, bringing back those classical themes. This stuff looks like it could have been made 1,500, 2,000 years earlier. And here's Ang, the guy I was just talking about, Ang versus Delacroix. And here is Napoleon on his imperial throne. Like I say, he wasn't the king. He was the emperor. And so here he is in all his grandiosity. And it's very ordered, it's very linear. The colors are muted, they're darker. And again, like a lot of this work, dark in the background. And I want to bring this up here too. This is another Ang. Thank you. Thank you. And this will be the last one I show you. I'm losing my audience here, but it's almost time. Wine. People have talked about this. This is a very famous painting too, by Ang. And it's called Grand Odalisque. And as I was saying, they like blue. They like dark colors. They like somber colors. And this is, in some ways, a more romantic theme. This is an exotic picture. You know what an odalisque is? Well, more for the memory banks. An oda is a room where a sultan or some sort of ruler, an ADAH or somebody from the Middle East, because you saw pest house at Jaffa. We know Napoleon went through the Middle East and he pretty much went face to face with what was the Arabic world, the Turkish world, the Islamic world, the Arabic world, all, you know, just in general. And he went to Egypt too. We'll talk about that. But bottom line is that artists, both neoclassical and romantic artists, started following Napoleon's armies around and bringing back images from those places Napoleon conquered, if you will. Well, when he went through what is today modern Turkey, Saudi Arabia, so on, run into these rulers, and it was basically it's kind of a tribal system, but the ruler, the sultan, he would have a harem. He would have a bunch of wives, if you will. Wasn't mono. Anyway, that's how they roll. This was like all new to the Europeans. And both these guys, these kinds of artists, Paul Run brought pictures back, made pictures about life in those exotic places that Napoleon had been. That was the pest house at Jaffa, that was all that stuff. But when Ang treated this, he treated it in a neoclassical way. It's more subdued, the colors, and line. And the lines are exaggerated for effect. We saw this with Parmigianino in mannerism, Madonna with the long neck, and the lines were exaggerated for theatrical effect. The lines here are exaggerated. In fact, I've seen some scholarly analysis of this painting, and the size of the legs don't really match up. But that's okay, because really it's about the composition of the lines. The whole proportion of her body is way off. But that's okay, because we want stability, line, the dark background, and so on. And so this is how Ang treated that. I want to see if I can pull this up here. And these are there. There's Delacroix, the other guy. Ang, neoclassic, Delacroix, same thing. From North Africa, women of Algiers in their apartment. And they likely are part of a harem, but it's not organized and its color is splashed around. We got here a maidservant. We got over here, I had a zoo, got a hookah going there. And, you know, it's the, you know, and in this case, you know, this is like the difference between how a romantic artist would handle the subject as opposed to how a neoclassical artist would handle the same stuff. And so with that, that's a good place to end. I got a lot of romantic artists to show you, as you kind of probably saw as I scrolling through this. But don't forget turning in that paper about the artwork that seems confusing, baffling, puzzling, hard to understand, something from the upcoming chapters. And that's all I had. Unless you got questions. No. Okay, what is an odalisque? Yeah. What's a pest house? You got it. We'll see you on Wednesday.